Okay, welcome. How is everybody? Let me get my hair fixed there. Good morning. So this is part one in a three-part series looking at Shakespeare's Othello. Today we're going to look at two things in this first part. Historical context. We're going to get some background on Elizabethan England, the late 16th and early 17th century England, when Shakespeare was in the prime of his life and producing the majority of his plays. We're going to look a little bit about Shakespeare's life, and then we're going to look specifically at the context of the title of the play, the Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. We'll just talk about some of the key concepts embedded in that title. What is exactly meant by a tragedy, the name Othello and what that might signify, the Moor, what is a Moor, and something about the historical context of Venice, that Renaissance Venice that Shakespeare is playing on. From there, what I'd like to do is just look at an overview of the whole plot. So one of the great challenges, the beauties and the challenge, it's a beauty because of the challenge, is the language. Shakespeare's language is intentionally challenging. We talked about at the very beginning of the semester the way in which accounts of the world or accounts of reality evolved in ancient worlds, starting out with poetry, and that poetry or myth or mythos was the primary way to articulate mankind's reaction to and experience of the cosmos, the world, reality, however you want to characterize it. And with poetry comes a very specific style of speaking or a mode of speech. And to put it in a nutshell, poetry, in its representation of the world, its articulation of the world, captures that world through metaphor and symbols. Right? It does not speak to us directly. It speaks to us in metaphors and symbols and analogies and allegories, and forces us to decipher them. And apart from the beauty of that, there is simply the being compelled to wade through the meaning of those metaphors and to translate them, to put them in our own language, is actually an experience that's very much akin to making sense of the world around us at large. Excuse me. The world presents us a lot of information, but its full meaning and what's really going on is hardly ever so clear, and therefore we need to use our minds to decipher it. In the same way, poetry speaks in symbols and metaphor, in part to capture the imagination, to provoke the senses, to provoke the emotions, what have you, but also to force you to penetrate the surface of the language in order to understand it, and therefore really have a deeper understanding of it, because in fact the poet is not telling you the whole story. They're giving you the keys that you need to decipher it on your own. And when you understand something on your own, you understand it in a fundamentally different way than when someone just spoon feeds it to you, right? So obviously one of the great challenges of Shakespeare is the language. And you'll notice this text, it has great footnotes at the bottom. Those footnotes are absolutely vital for two reasons. Number one, Shakespeare will simply use words that they're archaic, that are no longer everyday common words in the English language, right? He will use tenses of words that we have, but in tenses that we don't use anymore. Or he will use words that we have a common grasp of, right, but that are being used in a different way, either because in 17th century England they were used in a different way, or because he's bending and shaping and repurposing those words to give them new meanings and new layers of meanings. And remember, poetry is a compressed meaning, right? And there are just a variety of key terms throughout this text that bear multiple meanings as meaning is compressed into them. And we talked about, if you can remember, way back at the beginning of the semester, we talked about the concept of the meaning of a word is its use, or the context within which it is used. Any word, depending on how it's used in a specific context, has a slightly different meaning than, say, the dictionary definition. And there's nothing mysterious here going on. Let's just take some really simple examples to see this. So if I take the word cat from the dictionary, I look in the dictionary, it says, furry animal that is not man's best friend, and if you ask it to come, it will not do what you want, it will go off and do what it wants. Right? So cat means that. However, if I have a cat coming into my room right now, and I say the cat is sitting there before me, the meaning of the word is not exactly the same, and the differences matter, because now I'm talking about an actual cat in my presence rather than just a generic concept of a cat as a kind of universal category of a concept. Right? So the same is true of any pronoun, right? So when I say I or he and you say I or he, it means something different. And the important thing is all the key terms in this text bear those kind of multiple meanings, the kind of standard meaning of the word, and then a meaning that's being pressed on it by the language and the context of the story. So in light of the challenges of the language, what I want to do is today is to look at the plot and establish clearly what's going on. And I want to talk about two plots. I want to talk, first of all, the just kind of academic plot as it unfolds from Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. It's a 5-act play, right? And to establish the terrain, the trajectory of that plot. Then I also want to use the plot in a different way, and it is a way that dovetails with that, which is to say, I want to look at Iago's plot. This play is called The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. The more I read this play, the more I see that this play is less about Othello in some ways and more about Iago. Particularly in that Iago has a kind of godlike control over the action of the entire play. And I like to see him as a kind of puppet master, or a playwright, or a director, because he presents images to other people in order to deceive them, and not just to deceive them, to compel them to act in a certain way. And what he is able to do is to kind of, to use another metaphor, orchestrate the pieces on the chessboard and move them in certain directions by deceiving them in certain ways, telling them certain things, presenting them with certain evidence. That is his plot. And what do we mean by plot? By which we mean the events of a drama, or the events of a novel, the events of a poem, right? But we also mean by plot that other thing, that thing that is a criminal conspiracy, a contrived plan to perpetrate, in this case, a crime against Othello, but also against all the other major characters. And they all fall for this plot, or this kind of conspiracy of one, where he has a kind of diabolical plan in his mind. And we'll see when we look at his speech in the second video, we will see very clearly that this plot he has worked out in his mind at the very beginning of the play, in the early stages of Act 1. Shakespeare makes it very clear to us that Iago has a plan in his head that he talks about. He will give birth to these ideas. And the way in which he gives birth to them is, one, to speak them, to translate from what's inside to telling the viewer of the play, or the reader of the play. but also we see the plot unfold in the way he directs the other characters through various types of deceptions. Right? So in the next lecture, what we're going to do is going to look very carefully at Iago and who he is and what he's all about, because he seems to be, in many ways, the really central character of the play. And as a tragedy, this is an example of what's called a revenge play, typically in which a protagonist goes and seeks revenge for an injustice done to them. And the irony is, in a revenge play, it's the person seeking the revenge who is the protagonist. So that's what we'll do in the second part of these series of videos, is look at Iago. In particular, what we'd like to look at is Iago's motivation. In an early speech he gives in Act 1, he spells out what are his, let's be clear, his apparent motivations. And what's interesting is that over the course of the play, he actually attributes to himself a number of different motivations as to why he wants to bring down the Moor. But let's be clear, there's no accident here of what he's going to do. At the very outset of the play, every play comes in media res, in the middle of the thing, like we saw in Homer. And when we enter into the middle of the thing, everything in this play just about is already set in motion. The plot that he is conspiring, you could say, with himself to commit is already underway in the very first act in his conversation with Rodrigo. The only thing is that nobody else is aware that he's doing this, and every character will find out over time, and really not till the end do they realize both that Iago has been involved in this plot, and second, the way in which they've all been deceived, and they all find this simultaneously. And what's most fascinating, and Shakespeare does this in an unusual way, because his motivation starts to become, the word is overdetermined, right? If you give me one reason as to why you committed the crime, that's the reason I'm going to go with. But when you start giving me 5 different reasons, I'm going to start wondering, to commit such an act, you really have to have a kind of singular, clear motivation. To have multiple motivations, it doesn't seem to be intelligible. And we learn about this character that nothing that he says can be taken at face value. So human beings have the capacity to show an appearance and then to have something going on in their head and their heart that is contrary. Right? So we have this theme of hypocrisy. And he says by the end of the play, something like my true self will be revealed to the other characters and to the audience. The audience becomes aware of his diabolical plot early on because, in a sense, we're in on it. He's speaking to other characters, but there are times where he makes asides directly to us, in which he makes us, in a sense, co-conspirators. And if you watch the 1995 film with Lawrence Fishburne and Kenneth Branagh in it, that film is filmed excellently in terms of revealing some of the dramaturgy of this play, some of the kind of stagecraft going on that helps to clarify its meaning, given that when you have it written, all you have is dialogue and you don't have visuals and things of that sort. Which is, of course, another challenge in interpreting the language and interpreting everything that's going on, because in a novel you've got a narrator who normally, there's exceptions, of course, but normally a narrator tends to be more straightforward in describing the dramatic action that's unfolding. When you only have dialogue, right, mimetic dialogue, it presents challenges into fully understanding the situation in which the character is saying it and how it relates to the situation of the play generally, right? But it's the basic question of Iago's motive. And at the end, Othello asks Iago, essentially, why? Why have you done this to me? And his answer is, what you know, you know. What you know, you know. And he says, I will say nothing more. And there are many layers of meaning just to that statement. But the mystery of this man's motivation is one of the central elements of the play. It should also be said, Shakespeare, we'll look at him a little more focused way in a moment, but Shakespeare as a modern playwright, right? There's something fundamentally different in terms of his approach to creating a narrative and creating characters compared to what we've seen in the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, it is very apparent what is going to develop throughout the course of that epic poem. The characters are sculpted in kind of high relief, in black and white, high chiaroscuro, where it's very clear what kind of people these are. There is no ambiguity. There are facets to the character, but the character, which is to say, in different situations, different elements of the characters are revealed, no doubt, right? So in one situation, we see Odysseus is heroic and courageous. In another, we see he's wily and witty and sneaky. But this is all part of a whole, of a piece, if you will. Shakespeare, in a basic sense, is modern, for lack of a better word. I mean, this is the word that's used to describe him, and it's appropriate, particularly in terms of his realism. Now, I think your first reaction is, I just read this play, I read the language, it doesn't sound realistic to me, this is not the way people speak. This is true. This is not the way people speak. But if you think about the nature of the characters and the nature of the story and the way it unfolds, it is very realistic in the sense of things actually are not clearly foreshadowed. You don't know exactly how things are going to transpire. Things take you by surprise, like in real life. And the characters have a psychological dimension to them that ancient literature in general, not just Homer, but since we've read Homer, that's a good example. So we talked about the aner, the man that is polytropos, multifaceted, complex, complicated, right? Nonetheless, when you look at the motive, so we're going to talk about motivation, right? In Homer, motivations are clear and direct, and every character has a dominant motivation. They may have more than one, but they have a clear dominant motivation, and the text spells that out in the course. There is no doubt, despite the variation at times, that Odysseus wants to get home. Right? There is no doubt that Penelope wants the situation resolved. When we look at these characters, there are more layers to their psychology. And they have, at each layer, they're being pulled in a different direction. We talked about the human being, that passage, that great passage from Plato's Laws, in which the human being is like a puppet being pulled by three different strings in three different directions, and these three strings represent different motivational forces or sources within their soul, different passions that direct them toward different objects. And the problem is they're complicated and they need clarity about which direction they're going. So in Shakespeare, there are layers of different motivations, and the cause, the inner cause, by which I mean the psychological spring or motivation that drives the character to do what they do, at least in some of the main characters like Othello or more particularly Iago, the motivation is not so clear, right? And this is not an accident. This is Shakespeare's strategic decision to purposely make the motivations and internal forces that cause people to act unclear. And this is one reason why he's always considered distinctly modern in this way, in the way he portrays characters. You think of the whole Freudian look into the human psyche. which in some ways, starts with the beginning of great literature. There's a surface of human behavior and what people say they are about and what they think and what they do. And then we start to peel away the layers of the onion of human nature and human psychology. And we start to realize that there are many, 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 many forces or motivations that, two things, the person viewing isn't aware of in terms of the person's conduct and their psyche. But more importantly, maybe, that the person themselves, they're not fully aware of their own motivations, right? It's so-called the unconscious or the subconscious, right? That there are desires that we act on that we're not even aware of acting on fully. So in modern literature, and Shakespeare is really the epicenter of this in terms of cultivating this interest in human psychology and human motivations. So, on one hand, the conflict of the play is something set up by Iago in this plot that he's devised. And it creates a problem for all the characters, and then we see how it's going to be resolved. On the other hand, the real problem, or the real conflict, or the real mystery of this play is what is the motivation that sets Iago on a path toward creating and executing this plot, right? And the beauty of it is that there really is no clear one answer, right? Which means what you're forced to do is contemplate it, to think about it. Why is this human being acting this way? And you have to treat these characters as human beings, right? You have to get in their clothes, get in their shoes, and think about the human being that's operating here, and that this isn't just poetry, this isn't just entertainment. This is reality depicted, some elusive aspect of reality, and it forces us to meditate on these things. Othello is just as interesting as in terms of his motivations. Othello is presented as a character in a way that is not as nearly as multi-dimensional and maybe even as interesting as Iago. This is one of the fascinating things, that it is the diabolical evil character in this play who is the most intriguing, who is the most interesting, who is actually the closest to the viewer, to the audience. Othello is kind of at a distance, and in fact we see Othello through the frame or the lens of Iago's plot. Why Othello listens to Iago over the wife that he clearly loves, why he is vulnerable to this plot, why he falls for this plot, independent of Iago's ingenuity. We all know Iago is tremendously ingenious, and he's convincing, and he's an actor. And not only is he an actor, he's a psychologist. He knows the buttons in other people. He knows what motivates them. And therefore, because he knows what motivates them, he knows how to press their buttons and get them to do what he wants them to do by stimulating those desires. Independent of Iago's ingenuity, it is not clear exactly why Othello succumbs to this plot. Is it simple jealousy? Is it some issue with women? He feels threatened by women, not just his wife, but treating his wife as just an exemplary of the opposite sex. Is it his insecurities about being a Moor in European society? Is it his concern for reputation, in the sense that if he believes that everyone else in Venetian society believes that he's a cuckold and being cheated on, then he feels a diminution of his own worth and social standing within the hierarchy, the structure of Venetian society? The answer is all of the above, and we're not sure which one really matters, right? Because we also see that Othello, it's established very clearly on in Act 1. Othello is a decent man. And this gets into some of the issues surrounding his identity as a Moor in European society. Othello, it is presented to us in Act 1 that Othello has the virtues that are consistent, we could say the virtues and the principles that are consistent with Venetian society. He, in fact, exemplifies a number of virtues that in general, in the West, coming out of our Greco-Roman pagan tradition combined with the Christian tradition, he exemplifies some of its core virtues. And that he exemplifies them is really reinforced in Act 1 and made patently clear. So then the question becomes, well, what is this other side to him that brought this out? Would this kind of thing have happened to Othello had it not been for the diabolical plot of Iago? And then you get into interesting questions. This is what Shakespeare does. He provokes these kind of questions to create a conversation about these things. You're not going to find answers. This is not 2 + 2 = 4, right? This is not math class. This is human being class. And human beings are messy, right? And human situations are messy. What was my motivation? What really even happened in this situation? The answer is, I don't know and I don't know. You speculate and you contrive, but question becomes, would Othello have become jealous of his wife without Iago's plot? And that backs up into a question of who is really responsible for Othello killing or murdering, depending on how you look at it, his wife. Killing is the taking of life of another person. Murdering someone is taking their life unlawfully, immorally, against the law, against ethical code, and so on and so forth. Right? Not the same thing. And of course, in the sense that she is innocent, it's a murder. But in the sense that Othello is innocent, it's a killing, because he thinks his wife is guilty, and he has seen the ocular proof, right? Well, it's a challenging situation to make sense of, and that's exactly why Shakespeare presents it that way. When we look at this issue of culpability, Iago, Othello, right? We look at this issue of that Desdemona here is the ultimate victim. She is innocent in the sense of being naive and untarnished by the world, but also innocent in the sense that she committed no transgression. Those two obviously go together, but they're slightly different. She's naive. Othello, despite the fact that he commits the murder, is also an innocent victim. And I think then the question becomes, how innocent do you think he really is? And I like to leave that as I don't have some simple answer to that. And I think it's the question being proposed by the play that is up for you to think about and contemplate. But I'll leave you with this. Obviously, the primary mechanism by which Iago advances his plot is to tell people lies, right? And obviously, a number of lies are told to Othello to ultimately encourage him as, in a sense, Iago's instrument and even a kind of slave, a kind of animate tool to murder his wife. Plato says something very interesting about lies. He says, in effect, that every lie, it takes two. Just like it takes two to tango, it takes two to tell a lie. You need one person to tell a lie, but you need another person to believe it, right? There are certain lies people tell you that you don't even budge and you laugh about. You say, are you kidding me? Would you really even try to tell me that's true? It's so obvious to me that that's false. Get lost. Get lost, right? But then there are other lies that are more ambiguous, and what is the authority of the person telling you? What is the evidence they have? What kind of psychological button are they pushing in you that makes you inclined to believe it, right? There's all types of reasons why people believe things that are not true. It's not one thing, it's many things. Obviously, there's something in Othello's soul that makes him prone and susceptible to Iago's lies. On the other hand, Iago's really darn good. He fools everybody in the play, right? Although not to the extent of killing their wife. Although part of that has to do with that Iago's plot is primarily directed at the target Othello. So Plato says there are two types of lies. It takes two to tango, and there is a lie in speech, and there is a lie in the soul. The lie in speech is just what we all know is a lie. It's you say something that's not consistent with reality. And this raises one of the most fascinating things about language, and interesting things, which is language can be used to represent the world and truth, but it's also so malleable and so amorphous that language can tell lies. You can tell a lot more lies than you can tell truth. There's one truth and there's a million lies about that same thing, right? It's like there's one way to be right and a million ways to be wrong. Then he talks about a lie in the soul. And the lie in the soul is the lie the listener tells to themselves based on what the other person has said to them that's a lie. And what's interesting is this notion of a lie in the soul implicates the listener in perpetrating the lie on themselves. And therefore, any lie is not just a matter of deception by an outside person, but it is also a matter of self-deception. That you allow yourself to have the wool pulled over your eyes by somebody else. It's an act of self-deception, because the other person is only telling the lie in speech. It's you, the listener, who are telling the lie in the soul or deceiving yourself on the deepest level. So clearly, there is some type of culpability for Othello, and I think everybody reacts differently to him. And I think when you see the film, well, it cuts both ways. I don't want to say anything more about it. But there's clearly some culpability on Othello's part, because he looks, let's finish with this and get started here. He looks at the evidence presented by Iago, right? But he doesn't go to the source, right? And there are reasons for this, both about having to do with him, but the situation also. He doesn't go to his wife directly, or he doesn't try to learn from anyone else other than Iago. Why does he put so much faith in Iago? Why does he not trust his own instincts about his wife more? Right? Independent of how good a liar Iago is, these are the kind of questions we want to ask. So here is a spectacular shot of this film, with Othello at top in the background and Desdemona in the foreground. This is a shot from Orson Welles' wonderful version of Othello from the 1950s. It is a spectacular film. It is visually arresting. And the one thing that he does in that film is have this, and it's not uncommon to all his films, but this wonderful chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro is an Italian word typically associated with art history in describing the formal qualities of a painting or an image or a picture, right? And chiaroscuro literally means light and dark, or clear and dark, right? And it typically implies a dramatic contrast of light and dark that creates a kind of arresting and dramatic image. And because it's arresting and dramatic in its contrast, it has a kind of heightened emotional impact, right? So this play, drawing out some of the most extreme passions in human beings, this lighting is kind of perfectly consistent with the tenor and the theme of the play. It also serves to replicate the contrast in skin tone of the races from Othello the Moor to Desdemona the fair Venetian. And these themes of dark and light and black and white and fair and black have wordplay throughout the entire play, if you read carefully. So it's a constant, this dark light contrast. Themes like seeing versus not seeing, illusion, appearance versus reality, good versus evil, light skin versus dark skin. All these levels of meaning come into play in this play of light and dark. So now what we're going to look at is some of the historical context of this play. So here's our lovely image of the bard, William or Bill Shakespeare, right? So all of his plays were written during the period of Elizabethan England and then the beginning of the reign of King James at the beginning of the 17th century. So the Elizabethan period represents the period of the Renaissance in England, the 16th and 17th centuries. And of course the Renaissance means rebirth. It means the rebirth of ancient Greek and pagan culture in terms of philosophy, in terms of science, in terms of the arts, in terms of drama, in terms of literature, in terms of painting, sculpture, across the board. In Elizabethan England, one of the two primary modes of art that really experienced this kind of rebirth and regeneration were literature, particularly including drama, and then also music. Whereas if you think of the Italian Renaissance, you think of painting and sculpture, Michelangelo and Da Vinci, and so on. The Elizabethan period is named after Queen Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of King Henry VIII, who established the Church of England, independent from the Pope, in Rome. And the Elizabethan period came at a very specific time, this cultural flourishing and this kind of openness, and particularly a kind of exploration of the world and the human psyche in drama, it was made possible by coming between two very fraught periods in which religious tensions really reared their head and made for a more kind of conservative, a more rigid society and type of literature that didn't engage in such a kind of open-minded investigation. So prior to this period, you have the period of the Protestant Reformation, where there's a lot of conflict over Protestants and Catholics. And then after this period, that conflict in England flares up again, and you have basically in the middle of the 17th century, you have a revolution, more than one revolution, and you have the ascendancy of the Puritans in England. And of course, you know that the Puritans from England, they went from England to the Netherlands, and then they came to the United States on the Mayflower in the first couple decades of the 17th century. So that history here is germane. So giving birth to the Renaissance, the ancient pagan and Greek and Roman civilization, opened society to a point of view slightly different from Christianity, one that is more this-worldly than otherworldly, one that delights in the pleasures and the interests of this world. And particularly Shakespearean plays come on the heel of Christian morality plays, which are very often about the life of Jesus and various biblical moments, and they're all designed to teach Christian morality, Christian virtues, in a fairly didactic way. So one of the great elements of Othello, for example, is that obviously you have this battle of good and evil. Iago, in many ways, is really a kind of personification of evil. And yet, you don't have any strong, clear moral in this play. And, well, this is kind of like real life, isn't it? Bad people do bad things, and ends are left untied. And, people don't get punished in the way that you might hope, and this is just what people do. It's not what people should do, but it's what happens in the real world. And this interest in how people actually live and portraying realistically what they're actually like dovetails with the major influence of Niccolo Machiavelli in the English Renaissance. Machiavelli was a political scientist and statesman, and he was really concerned in understanding politics. The expression came to be to take men as they really are and not as they should be. So if you think of what a didactic or a preaching or a teaching morality play would be about, its goal would be to show people as they ought to be. Remember we talked about the goal of ancient poetry and literature is to please Horace, to please and instruct, to please and instruct. So you please by giving delightful images and an engaging story, interesting characters. But you instruct by giving characters that present a model of comportment, right, by which you see what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a good human being? What does it mean to be a good devotee of the Christian God? And so on and so forth. Here, we do not see any model to be emulated. We see real people acting in real ways with real consequences, which are tragic in the sense that there is no real positive resolution to this play. There is no happy resolution to it. And the victim, Othello, is in some sense just as guilty as Iago, or in some degree guilty, right? So Shakespeare has, since about the 19th century, been seen as not only the greatest playwright of the Elizabethan period, but the greatest playwright of the English language. Harold Bloom, a critic, and for lack of a better word, a great fan of Shakespeare. He has a book on Shakespeare called Inventing the Human. And what he really means is inventing the modern human. And he makes an argument, and many people disagree, but it's a fascinating one, that Shakespeare's plays, in their characterization of human psychology and human situations, human motivation, become the paradigm by which modernity thinks about the individual, their actions, their motivations. In the same way, for example, I wasn't really alive to see this either, but I certainly saw it in popular culture, in films, in cartoons, and various things. There was a moment in the United States in the 1940s and 50s that the popular influence of Sigmund Freud in popular culture, you think of like Hitchcock films, but also in psychoanalysis, where people are actually in various forms of Freudian analysis. It was like America as a society at large, whenever it tried to understand itself, its motivations, its desires, understood it in Freudian terms. What's so fascinating about that is that that moment has clearly passed, and many people look askance at Freud in the academy these days. And if you're not in the academy, you've probably not even read anything of Freud. So Bloom makes this argument that Shakespeare has given us a kind of paradigm or framework by which we think of ourselves as modern people, by which we understand the way we're motivated, our desires, how we look at the world, what's in the world to find, and so on and so forth. So I'll just read from here. So Shakespeare, between 1585 and 1592, began a successful career in London as an actor, writer, and part owner of a playing company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which later became the King's Men, and that is King James's Men. He worked for a royal theater company that was essentially employed by the throne, the Queen and King of England, first Elizabeth, and then James. And what's fascinating is he wrote this is one of his most important contributions, a series of history plays charting the history of England based on some of the most important kings coming out of the medieval period that led into the historical and political moment that they were living in at the time, such that he was charting a kind of origin myth by which we would understand the present political history of the nation, in the same way a filmmaker might today, make a film about the founding of the United States and shape our own self-understanding by looking back at our origins. But the interesting thing is, doing this, taking on this task, working as part of a Royal Theatre Company, suggested that there was a certain propagandistic element, and the house or the family from which Queen Elizabeth came from tends to be, in these history plays, presented in a positive light as some of the dominant positive forces in English history going back to the medieval period. And the last thing, it's important, there is a great mystery surrounding the personal life of William Shakespeare outside of these plays that have been handed down through time to us today. The basic facts of his birth and death are known, and where he apparently went to school, but there is very little known about his own private life, except as it's found in some way manifest in the plays, and also his sonnets and other poetry. He's a prolific writer. And so there are tremendous questions about things like his sexuality, his relationships, his religious beliefs. It is always a dubious thing to read a novel or a play or any work of literature and assume you're getting some kind of diaristic autobiography of the playwright or the novelist. If they wanted to come out directly and tell you about themselves, they could do that in their own voice. The fact that they are a playwright means they're not interested in telling you about the world in that way, and maybe not interested in telling you about themselves exactly, right? There is a wonderful motif in Stendhal. Stendhal was late 18th, early 19th century French writer, and he was part of a kind of school of realism that superseded and rejected Romanticism in a variety of ways in France. And he talked about the novel as being as holding a mirror up to nature, and he uses this image quite vividly. And does Shakespeare want to tell you about himself? I'm not so sure. My impression is, at least the first observation that should and needs to be made, is that he's trying to hold up a mirror not just to English society, but to some kind of truths about human nature itself. And his reading, his exposure to Greek and Roman literature, to Renaissance literature, to the Bible that filters through in his dramas, make it clear that he has a much more grand purpose in mind than simply telling you about who he slept with or what their sexual orientation and gender were. On that point, it must be mentioned the place where virtually all his mature plays were performed, and that is the Globe Theatre that existed in London, that was built to his specifications in 1599 as he was part of this troupe called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the Globe Theatre. And you can Google the Globe and see images, but here I've got a cross-section so you can see inside. There's a stage there with a circular theater. It's a perfectly circular theater. And it has the shape of, to the extent that it can, a globe, right? And the globe connects to the world at large. And this has some really important implications for understanding perhaps what Shakespeare thought he was really putting on display in these plays. What is his intention behind them, given that the author doesn't speak directly? The name the globe came from a Latin saying that all the world's a stage, right? So now, if all the world is a stage, now he's taking the world and making it into a stage called the globe, right? In which I think this statement can go two ways. On one hand, what do we do in life? We act. We have plots. We have motivations. There are storylines. There are primary characters. There are subordinate characters. There are all the themes that are on the stage. We are actors. This is an ancient concept, but we're all actors in a play that we're not fully aware what the plot is and who is who. Think about that metaphor of the divine puppet in Book 1 of Plato's Laws. A puppet is on a stage in a theater, and there's someone above manipulating that puppet, and if we just take it at face value, the divine puppet is being puppeted by the gods, right? So it suggests where do our motivations come from? What is the plot of life? Where does it come from? Who is in charge of the story? And so on and so forth, right? But also that what the globe would depict is not parochial subject matter that deals with simply topical themes or simply with British history, for example, but what's contained in these plays and what's displayed on that stage of the Globe Theater is a kind of microcosm of everything in the world, right? The breadth of experience. And this is where the Renaissance, particularly in England, its Machiavellian influence of taking human beings as they really are, this concern for realism, and a certain amorality, not immorality, but amorality, accepting the world for what it is and being in some sense resigned to some of the darker corners of it as being just as much part of the world as the positive things. And therefore saying, we shouldn't turn our heads, we shouldn't look away from what the world really is like, and this is a little perverse, but let's celebrate what the world is. And you can see on the right here that there are sources. Petronius, a famous Roman poet, said, all the world is a playground. This became all the world is a stage. And this line actually finds its way into one of Shakespeare's plays. In As You Like It, there is a fool by the name of Jaques who says all the world is a stage, and he gives a very famous speech. So I'm not going to touch on everything here because we've already talked about it a little bit, but the Shakespeare's plays have been broken up into 4 dominant genres, and this will play into the genre of Shakespeare's Othello and the significance of that genre. So history plays, particularly some history plays dealing with Greek and Roman history, but normally when critics and scholars think of the history plays, they think primarily of those plays dealing with English history that are being told in the present as they reflect on English identity and shape an understanding of the past and how it relates to the present. Then there are the tragedies, of which Othello is obviously one of the great examples. Comedies, which include romances, and then so-called problem plays. And problem plays are really, they're problems in 2 different ways. They are a problem in a sense that they are a problem of genre. There are plays that scholars and critics have not found a satisfactory genre to fit them in because they have a certain amount of tragedy, certain amount of comedy, this is important actually in the sense that they don't fit these stereotypes. And that is actually consistent with this era's interest in a kind of realism or verisimilitude. Life does not fit into a category or a stereotype. It has its own dimensions, and it's unique to itself. And that aspect of the problem of genre captures the nature of our reality around us. The other meaning of problem play was plays that address and present topical social problems contemporaneous of the day. But now let's look at the title. Let's go back for a second. Let's just read it again. The Tragedy of Othello, comma, the Moor of Venice. Right? So we've got a tragedy. Let's state the obvious. It's about Othello, but Othello is not just Othello. He is also the Moor of Venice. He has a dual identity. And we will see him described at various moments as Othello, good Othello, General Othello, Commander, Warrior Othello, and then we'll see him as described as the Moor, right? This is interesting. When the other characters acknowledge their respect for him, he's called Othello. Othello is his specific name, but when there are negative statements, pejorative statements made about him, he will be called the Moor. He won't be understood by his particular identity. He'll be understood by a stereotype that the Venetians have of Moors. We will also notice in Othello's treatment of his wife, she will be fair Desdemona when he's happy with her and in love with her, highlighting her distinct character. And in another instance, she'll be described as a woman, in which her identity, her particular identity, will be subsumed by a kind of stereotype, right? So tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy owes its form and structure to Senecan tragedy, which is loosely based on ancient Greek tragedy. What is ancient Greek tragedy all about? You have a great hero, a person who is almost superhuman. They are superior to the average person. They are extraordinary. They are extraordinary. They're able to do things that no one else is able to do, and they suffer a calamitous downfall, often because of something of their own blindness. By which to say is these characters have many abilities and attributes, and yet they still have a blind spot that they, under their own powers, they cannot solve all their problems. And the whole concept of tragedy was, I think, to highlight two primary features that are intrinsic to the human condition or human nature or human experience. One is that even the most superior human beings fall and suffer various types of downfall. There is no person who is perfect, right? It seems to be. There is no human being who is actually a god. Everyone puts their pants on one leg at a time. The other thing is, and connected with that no human being, however superior, is ever completely in control of their own fate, despite all the powers and faculties they may have at their disposal, despite the fact that they may be able to do things that other human beings can't, that they're not able to. Exceptional human beings nor ordinary human beings are able to outwit fate, right? So this makes a more general statement about the human condition of all human beings, which is an acknowledgement that there are forces outside our own control that even the best of us cannot rectify or remedy, and that we have to accept in a sort of resigned way. We have to resign ourselves to realities in human life that are beyond our own control. What you would call tragic resignation. Tragic resignation. So, in ancient tragedy, every tragic hero had many great attributes, but also what was called a tragic flaw, and they suffer from a grave error through what's called hamartia, and that's actually a word that comes from Aristotle's Poetics, and it actually means missing the mark. So he uses the metaphor of an archer shooting to a target, and the main character misses the mark, and the mark is their goal, their objective, that they think they can obtain under their own powers, but they fail. And this leads to what's called a reversal of fortune. In Greek, it's peripeteia. And important that the concept of reversal of fortune means two things coupled together. One, it means a dramatic change in fortunes or chance, bad luck, in circumstances of the character. But it also implies a reversal, a kind of a coming to awareness of who they really are. A process of anagnorisis is the Greek word. So, who Othello is at the beginning of the play is very different from who we're going to discover he is at the end of the play. He's going to be fleshed out. Does he change? Well, that's another interesting question. It's not clear that he changes. It's not clear that he doesn't change. Do human beings change? Shakespeare raising this question in terms of a realistic understanding of human beings, in suggesting the possibility of change. When we look at in the Odyssey, it's kind of funny. I mean, we said that one of the primary aspects of Odysseus's journey is a journey of the mind, of the soul, that he develops as a character. Can he curb his desires? Which is to say, can he educate himself, or can his experiences educate him to change, and you could say to become a better man, to become more virtuous, so on and so forth. On the other hand, the extent to which Odysseus changes, there's nothing actually unexpected. We know how he has to change. He has to become more mature. When he becomes more mature, he's not like he's a qualitatively different person. Rather, he's just he's amplified something that's already we can see in his character from the beginning. We see that he's wise. He's said to be wise. Now he just needs to be wise all the time or in the decisive moments. Whereas, when we're talking about change of characters in a Shakespearean drama, we're talking about them discovering that they're really not who we thought they were. And they haven't just changed in terms of exemplifying a potential that we already saw, but by becoming something we really didn't expect them to become, right? Because we see something that had been concealed prior to that. So tragic plays in the Renaissance were also associated with revenge tragedies or revenge plays, in which a protagonist seeks revenge for an imagined or actual injury. Right? Is Iago's injury that he suffers, that he seeks revenge, is it imagined or is it real? And which revenge is this about? Is this about Iago's revenge against Othello? Or is it about Othello's revenge against his wife, who he assumes has been unfaithful to him? The character of Othello is in fact based on a story by Boccaccio. Boccaccio is one of the most important Renaissance writers of Italy. He was influential throughout Italy, Spain, and also in England. Again, part of this school of writing that was determined to present a more realistic image of the world and break out, despite the fact that the Renaissance means rebirth of classical Greece and Rome, they actually started breaking out as they used and developed those genres and stock characters and what have you. They start to break out of them. And by the 17th century, you have what's called the Baroque period, in which you have a type of verisimilitude that's very different from classical literature. And Boccaccio really sets that in motion. But he has a story about un capitano moro, a Moorish captain. And so this character is something of a stock character, but it's a stock character particularly to the times in the aftermath of the reconquest of Europe from the Arab Empire that had existed since the Middle Ages. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. So this gets us to our next topic, Moor. Moor is a Muslim of a mixed Berber and Arab people inhabiting northwestern Africa, a region of Africa called the Maghreb. And so those were people who had been living in North Africa, who had mingled with the Arabs who had come from the Middle East to conquer North Africa, to conquer southern Italy, to conquer southern Spain, and to establish an Arab Muslim empire during the Middle Ages that actually was the carrier and cultivator of actually ancient Greece and Rome, of all things. So what's fascinating when we look at the context of this play, the Europeans, Venice, they are in a war with the Turks, the Muslim Turks, that is based on the historical facts about the Renaissance conflict, and a conflict that actually percolated all the way into the beginning of the 20th century in World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks, were taken out of existence. But this ongoing struggle to reconquer parts of Europe that Spain and Italy had reconquered themselves in the year 1492. So there's a tremendous 1492. It was, of course, the year of Columbus's voyage, but it is also the year where Spain reasserted itself and had the ability to reassert itself and reconquer its own lands. So if you go to southern Spain today, still today, you will find mosques, right? And you will find a whole culture in southern Spain. Its cooking, its attitude, its architecture that is influenced by this moment in time. And the Moors, the Arabs, were forced to either convert or be exiled or be put to death. So there are all these lurking tensions between Europe and its identity and the Arab Muslim world. And so this is all the background for this play, and therefore what is so interesting about it is Othello the Moor is a general in a European Venetian army that is fighting against Muslims. And of course, to complicate matters, Othello is a Christian, and Othello exhibits the virtues of a European. He exhibits the virtues of a Christian. Nonetheless, he has a background that is not Christian and that is presented as a kind of foil to European values. And his own heritage, going back to his mother, is clearly his native heritage, not his European heritage, which is something he is probably the first generation to really have fully existed within this European context and taken on its values. So there's a sense in which the proximity of this other culture from which he came, of one generation, is actually lurking in him. Like the play seems to present him as a character as, once you start peeling the layers of the surface of his character, the kind of layers of the onion, you start to get down to a character whose ways are tied more to the Arab Moorish world than to the European world, right? Okay. So now I want to talk about Venice, because Venice, another name, the Moor of Venice, plays a central role in this play. So Venice, as today, but it was a famous Renaissance city-state, a city that has ancient origins. It was one of the most powerful commercial and naval city-states in the Western Hemisphere. And it was really In terms of European culture, it was at the spearhead of fighting this large war between the Muslim Turks and the Europeans that was raging and raged on and off to varying degrees for a few hundred years. So it is a kind of outpost in kind of the eastern part of Western Europe that is along the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean is the body of water that takes one from Europe to the Middle East. It is as today, or it was as today, a cultural capital, tremendously sophisticated, tremendously urbane. So in many ways, Shakespeare, in crafting Venice as a character of the play, gives her many historical attributes that are well consistent with history. In particular, the characters who come from this environment of Venice have a certain understanding of life, have a certain sophistication about life that Othello does not seem to have. And actually his wife, Desdemona, is a kind of an outlier. In particular, they're both naive and innocent in certain ways. Now, Desdemona is young, so in a sense it's no surprise her degree of innocence. But Othello is a man who's been through war, and he's seen a lot. He's seen things that the ordinary person doesn't see. You would think he has a tremendous amount of perspective, but there's something about him, and it's on display in his falling in love with Desdemona and the way he falls in love and the feelings surrounded. He has a certain innocence and naivete, whereas the Venetian society is very sophisticated and urbane to the point of being almost cynical. They understand that people do all kinds of things, to come back to taking people as they really are. People do a lot of funny things. They do things that are not good. And that's just kind of the way that it is. That's the way of the world, right? That's be sophisticated about the world. You realize that's the way of the world. And therefore, these two characters as victims, they are innocents in the sense of being naive in a certain way compared to the kind of urbane life of Venice. It's also important to note that Iago's plot is unfolded not in Venice, but on the island of Cyprus, right? Othello is called to the Doge's palace, or it's the Duke, but in Venice he's called the Doge. He's basically the president of the Venetian Republic, and he says to Othello, "We've got word that the Turkish fleet is advancing on Cyprus, and we need you, the general, to go and defend basically what's a citadel. It's a kind of fortification." And it is when they get to Cyprus that this is where most of the play really takes place, in Cyprus. And it is a place removed from civil society. It's a military outpost. It's like a military base. And it seems to be that in this setting, it is the very location where Iago is really able to completely unfold his plot. And that one gets the impression that had he not had this opportunity of this wartime context in Cyprus, away from Venice, that he wouldn't be able to pull off this plot at all. So here we have this great picture of Venice. Venice is most definitely a character in this play that influences the attitudes of particularly all the Venetians. And in some sense, Iago is this great representation or representative of Venice. So here we're looking at part of the Piazza San Marco in the very middle, and what's called the Doge's Palace on the left, with the arcading there. And then what we see is the big canal, which is one of the famous things about Venice, is it's basically built on a lagoon and built up from stones and wood that's basically been piled on a marsh area to make a city, and that instead of having streets for the most part, it has canals where boats can go back and forth. And you've probably seen many films with famous shots of this city. The Doge's Palace, that is where Othello is summoned in Act 1, where the Doge, or in the text it's the Duke, calls him to military service. So this isn't just a Renaissance play, it's a play about the Renaissance, right? And Venice is now a kind of emblem of the Renaissance, the rebirth of culture in Italy. So some important things to keep in mind. Renaissance means rebirth, and it means rebirth particularly of ancient Greek and Roman culture, pre-Christian pagan ideas, and ultimately these pre-Christian pagan ideas were very often synthesized and married to Christian ideas. So, of course, Greece and Rome existed before the time of Christ, before Christianity ever existed. And then, of course, Rome gets Christianized as Paul goes out and proselytizes amongst the Romans, because before that, it was Jews that were converted into Christians. So you get a synthesis of these two sets of values. In some cases they're harmonious, and in some cases they're not. One of the themes that's lurking in this play is that Greek and Roman thought, its worldview, is very what you would call this worldly. And it's something we saw in the Odyssey in contrast to, say, the story of Job. In the story of Job, he is completely dedicated to this otherworldly concern of faith in God, this being that is beyond time and beyond space. And his concern is higher than his family, higher than his wealth, higher than his reputation. When we look to the Odyssey, we see a character who is concerned with his reputation, concerned with worldly well-beings, likes things in this world, and is rebellious in many ways toward the gods. Right? In particular, the Greeks were concerned with what they called virtue. And virtue means human excellence. And what's interesting is, and you see this in the Odyssey, you see a priority of a concern for human excellence over piety to the gods. Right? And the interesting thing, or the problem, is that human excellence comes in many forms. Excellence simply means a superb ability to do something. But one could have a superb ability to do good. One could have a superb ability to do diabolical things. And in fact, the same superb ability might allow you to do good things or bad things. If we look at Iago, he is a character who, dare I say this, is an image of human excellence. He is the most intelligent character in the play. He is the most rational character in the play. And he is the one character who is able to execute his will throughout the entirety of the play toward the very end in the way nobody else is. It's really important when we read this play to understand how this moment in the Renaissance, both what's depicted in the play, but also the way Shakespeare is thinking about it as a dramatist, there is this synthesis of cultures between Christianity and the Christian point of view, reference to biblical passages, references to biblical language, references to Christian values, and then references to pagan values or pagan virtues and language that bespeaks of the classical world. And then we have a third element in this mixture or synthesis, which is the virtue of Machiavelli. And we've talked about the concept of virtue. We've said it means human excellence. And for Machiavelli, when he talked about human excellence, he very often spoke about it as detached from moral good and evil or right and wrong. When you see Plato or Aristotle talk about human virtue, they talk virtue is connected with the good or the just or the righteous or what's good or what is beneficial for a human being. There is no virtue of being a bank robber. There is no virtue of being able to drink a lot of wine, because these things are bad. Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, and this is something we'll talk about when we look at Iago more, he will give a new Renaissance, very realistic meaning to this concept of virtue, and simply talk about it as human excellence to do good and to do ill. And lastly, it's important to point out, we've already established that Othello has this conflict of identities. Othello is both a European and not a European. But the important observation here to be made is he exhibits the Christian and pagan virtues to a T, and they make him exemplary and worthy of honor and respect in this society, which makes the skepticism or suspicion toward him as all the more interesting, that he has basically embodied Western society here. So, Renaissance Italy, Renaissance Venice, becomes this kind of synthesis of these different virtues, and the characters in this book, who are denizens of Venice, exhibit a certain type of urbane sophistication and even light-heartedness about the world. They like the world, but they also know not to get too attached to it, because people do naughty things, and that's just the way it is. And this will be one of the problems for Othello, that he attaches himself, and he has a kind of pure and innocent love that isn't urbane or sophisticated, doesn't understand the gray areas of morality too well. So the citizens of Venice are very, very worldly or world-wise, and it's very often illustrated, this aspect of their personalities, in their sense of hypocrisy and duplicity. They are hypocritical and duplicitous. Why? Because they expect other people to be hypocritical and duplicitous. Machiavelli has one of his great lines in The Prince. He says, "In a world where people are bad, a good man will come to his ruin. If the prince wants to succeed in a world of men who are not good, the prince must learn how not to be good. He must learn how to be bad and naughty. Maybe not evil, but in a world where people are not good, you will come to your ruin by following the good rules," right? This is a dark observation. This is a little cynical observation. Everybody knows this is true. The only thing is, you're not supposed to say it, but Machiavelli does, right? And so everybody in the society gets this principle, except for Othello and Desdemona. Othello is a man of his word. What's inside Othello is the same thing you see on the surface. What's inside Desdemona is the same thing you see on the surface, which is all the more ironic, because then Iago will paint this picture that what is on the surface of Desdemona is actually different from what's inside. In particular, this world is influenced by a basic sense of self-interestedness, an acknowledgement of the all too human limits of human beings. We don't expect them to be angels. We don't expect them to be saints. We are not surprised when people commit transgressions, and we're not surprised when we do it, because that's just called getting by in the world and living, right? So this is actually not Iago, because Iago is no ordinary interested man. He is diabolical. He is almost the personification of evil. So we'll have to differentiate the kind of more subtle transgressions of the Venetians from the diabolical of Iago. And of course, when the Venetians discover what Iago has done, they are appalled because of the magnitude of his transgression. So the opening of Othello starts with this conversation between Rodrigo and Iago, where both of them are trying to execute their own plot. Rodrigo is interested in Desdemona, and Iago is exploiting that interest to foment his own plot against Othello, and he goes at great length describing his intentions regarding Othello and his supposed motivations. After that, we become aware that Othello is actually in the process of marrying Desdemona in a clandestine way without the consent of her father, who is a senator in the Venetian, the government of the Venetian Republic, and therefore a nobleman, an esteemed man. And they've gotten married behind his back. And his name is Brabantio. Brabantio ends up confronting Othello, a man he's actually known for many years and has great respect. And now he simply sees them no longer as Othello, the great general, and a man worthy of admiration. Now he is just the Moor. But Brabantio says something to Othello about the transgression that Desdemona has committed against her father that gives us an insight into how Venetians operate in terms of their hypocrisy, particularly as it pertains to the relationship between the sexes. And this is obviously the key theme here as it plays out in the relationship between Othello and Desdemona. So he is very upset. He has been betrayed by his daughter, right? And Brabantio says to Othello, "Look to her more, if thou hast eyes to see. She has deceived her father, and may thee." And this is a very interesting remark, because there's a kind of bind with what Desdemona has done. She loves her husband innocently and truly, it seems. And nonetheless, in order to execute her love for her husband in terms of getting married, she has had to violate the trust of her father, which sets up a paradigm of her willingness to betray men in general. And so Brabantio, obviously on one hand, he's expressing his own bitterness. If she's going to betray me, why doesn't she betray you too? And I'll feel better when she's done that. But it sets up a question mark, both about Desdemona specifically, and more generally about how relationships between men and women play out, that people deceive one another, they're hypocritical. So, what is one of the motifs that unfolds with Othello and his wife? Othello confronts her and says, "Are you faithful to me? Are you faithful to me?" And Desdemona says, "Of course I am, honey. Of course." Now think about it for a second. If she were cheating on her husband, and Othello asked, "Are you cheating on me, honey?" Well, how is she going to respond? "Of course not, honey. I love you." Right? He's going to get the exact same answer. So you see this logic of that confrontation is actually being set up here. And the seed of doubt, the first seed of doubt, is being placed into Othello's mind and Othello's heart over his wife. And it's being done not by anyone, but by her father. So now we're looking at Act 4, Scene 3, around lines 53, 54. And this is a conversation between Emilia and Desdemona. Desdemona, the wife of Othello, and Emilia, who is her handmaid around her house. And of course, Emilia is also the wife of Iago. Iago is incredibly worldly, but also diabolical. Emilia, no surprise, is very urbane and sophisticated, and she doesn't get hurt at the little transgressions of the world. And they enter into a discussion of, do men and women cheat on each other, and how big a deal that is. Eventually it comes out that Emilia suspects that her husband has cheated on her at whatever stage. And, Desdemona, isn't this a problem? This is a great transgression. This my great love, soiled by infidelity. And Emilia's response is, this is what human beings are like. They cheat. Don't lose sleep over it. Don't crimp your brow. Go out and have your fun, and your solution will not be to suffer, but rather to be duplicitous and to continue to present yourself as an innocent woman, something very important in this society. So Desdemona here says, I called my love false love, but what said he then? It says, and we're dealing at the stage here in which Othello is making accusations to Desdemona. Desdemona is clearly aware that there's something wrong, and she's upset, and she wants it resolved, and she's trying to understand what's going on with Othello, and she has been accused of being unfaithful, and she says, essentially, doth this problem with Othello, does it bode weeping? Doth that bode weeping, she says? As in, my situation, is it worth crying over? And here's Emilia's response, a very different character from Desdemona. 'Tis neither here nor there. Desdemona responds, I have heard it said so. Oh, these men! Dost thou in conscience think, tell me, Emilia, that there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kind? So, Desdemona has that stereotype that men abuse their wives, that they step out on their wives, that they cheat their wives, but her stereotype of women is that they stay pure, that they stay chaste, that they stay faithful. And she can't imagine anything else. So she's asking Emilia, an older woman, middle-aged woman, who's had more experience. Desdemona's actually quite young. She's a teenager. She simply has not been out in the world. That is one reason why she's so innocent. And Emilia says, there be some such. There are some women who abuse their husbands, by which she's implying cheat on them. She says, no question. Would thou do such a deed for all the world? Desdemona, would you cheat on your husband for all the world? Emilia's going to answer, yes, and for a lot less than all the world. And, of course, Desdemona, the most important thing to her is her love and her fidelity. And she can't imagine anything being more important. And, of course, Emilia has been around the block a few times, and she has a very different point of view. And she says, why would not you? Desdemona, know by this heavenly light. And the heavenly light is truth. The heavenly light is the good. The heavenly light is God. God is watching me. His heavenly light is shining on me. I am not going to commit it. This is a sin, right? It's not just a transgression of another human being. It's a sin. Emilia says, nor I either by this heavenly light. I might as well do it in the dark. So she's not gonna go behind her husband's back in the light, but she'll do it in the dark where it's concealed. She'll be a hypocrite. Desdemona, would thou do such a deed for all the world? Emilia, the world's a huge thing. It's a great price for a small vice. For Emilia, this cheating on her husband is a small vice. It's a trivial thing. It's not really something to lose sleep over. It's not that important. Desdemona, good troth, I think thou would not. By my troth, I think I should, and undo it when I've done. Mary, I would not do such a thing for a joint ring, for measures of lawn, nor for gowns, petticoats, nor caps, nor any petty exhibition, but for the whole world? For the whole world, God's pity, who would not make her husband a cuckold to make him a monarch? I should venture purgatory for it. So what is she saying here? She's willing to cheat on her husband in order to advance his political position. And she'd be happy to be put in purgatory for it. So what is purgatory? Purgatory is this realm between heaven and hell that when you die, your soul goes into the kind of like toll booth, waiting station of purgatory until it's finally released either to go to heaven or to hell. And the point here is she doesn't care about her soul in the afterlife. She doesn't believe much likely in the afterlife at all. What matters is this life and this world, the here and now. Desdemona, beshrew me, if I would do such a wrong for the whole world. She would never do it. Why, the wrong is but a wrong in the world, and having the world for your labors, 'tis a wrong in your own world, and you might quickly make it right. Desdemona, I do not think there is such a woman. Desdemona says, I do not think there is such a woman. Emilia has made it pretty clear by her admission that not only is she admitting these things, she likely does them herself. And this illustrates Desdemona's complete naivete, that even in the face of an admission, she can't acknowledge that this is an admission of an actual fact rather than just a hope or an opinion. Emilia says, yes, a dozen, and as many to the advantage as would store the world they played for. But I do think it is their husbands' fault if the wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour out their treasures into foreign laps, or else break out into peevish jealousies, throwing restraints upon us, or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Well, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet we have some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see, they smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour. So let husbands know that wives have sense like them. That means reason. That means women are just as cunning and just as smart and just as sneaky and can conceal their actions just like men, and can see and smell before them. And she says they have palates for both sweet and sour. They have tastes for all kinds of things, even things that sour maybe. They have tastes for good and bad, right? And have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it doth. It's frailty that thus errs. It is so too. And have not we affections? Have we women not also desires? Desires for sport? What is sport? So sport is like play. It's not about good or evil. It's about having fun, right? Desires for sport and frailty as men have. Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. So where do women learn to be naughty? They learn it from their husbands, right? So if a husband ever blames the wife for doing something, it's because she learned it from him. So let's just recap the significance of this dialogue and this speech by Emilia, a very famous speech. It reveals their relationship with morality and how they negotiate with one another. And she really hits on it at the end. Human nature is frail and it errs. What do you love more, your principles of right and wrong or human beings? If you're going to love human beings and you're going to love yourself, you're going to have to accept the flaws of human nature, the flaws of others, and the flaws of yourself. Therefore, you will tolerate the transgressions that are committed because that's human nature. But it also means you're going to permit yourself to indulge in those transgressions yourself.